growing up now is so completely different from what it was like to grow up in the 1950s or the 1980s or even the 2000s. It's almost like growing up in two different countries. So I've structured the presentation around the cultural trends that have had the biggest impact on millennials and iGen, especially in the workplace. So the first of those is the speed of development. How quickly or slowly do children and teens grow up? So this is something a lot of people talk about here, that they'll say, so I have a Gen X friend of mine who talks about this. She used to walk to school by herself when she was 6 years old. She now has a 6-year-old son, and when he walks to the end of the block, neighbors will walk him back home thinking that he's lost. And there's actual data on this. Kids now are just a lot less likely to walk or bike to school by themselves compared to, say, in the 1960s, 1970s, and 80s, they'd be more likely to walk or bike by themselves. So this is a bigger cultural story, a bigger trend, that at times and places, when people live longer, when healthcare is better, especially for kids, and when education takes longer, parents tend to make the choice to have fewer children and nurture them more carefully. So that's known as the slow life strategy. It's a pretty good description for how we raise kids now. So that's in contrast to the model not that long ago, in the mid-20th century, when instead people would have a lot of kids and just hope it worked out. That's how people used to do things. So that was my mother's family, for example. She grew up one of 8 children on a dairy farm in Minnesota, in the middle of the country. And my uncles would tell me these crazy stories about them growing up, like, oh, we went swimming in the river, and the neighborhood girls, they stole our clothes. They tell the story all the time, like every single family reunion. So I finally had to ask them, well, how old were you when that happened? When you were going off by yourself, going swimming, and you got in trouble. So one of my uncles goes, I don't know, I think I was 8 or 9. Wait, what? Where were your parents when this is happening? Because these days that would be unheard of. So then I realized, well, that was my grandparents. They had 7 other children. They were running a farm, and that's how you raise kids back then. It was free-range kids. It was be home at dinner. That's how it was done. So that's the fast life strategy. Bigger families, even kids who came from smaller families, that was the cultural norm for kids to develop independence at an earlier age. So that's the fast life strategy. So this theory of slow versus fast has another feature to it. It explicitly says neither one of these is all good or all bad. It's just an adaptation to a particular place and time. So keep that in mind when I show you some of the trends, because it's tempting to say, oh, but I think that's a good thing, or I don't know about that, that's not how I was raised. Try to set that aside for a minute when you see the trends and instead focus on what does this mean for how quickly or slowly kids and teens are growing up. So this idea that teens grow up faster now, sorry, let me go back. This idea that teens grow up slower now, that we have a slow life strategy now, challenges something I hear a lot of parents say. A lot of parents will instead say, oh, but kids are growing up faster than they used to. And I think they're thinking about all the information that they can get online, and although that's true, I think that viewpoint also has some nostalgia to it. It has this idea of, oh, when I grew up, it was a much more innocent time. But was it really? I think we have some photographic evidence to suggest maybe it wasn't quite so innocent. So I could show you a lot of different photos to illustrate this. This is just one set of them that I found recently. This is places that teens used to go to hang out at the roller rink, 1970s, 1980s, very common. And of course, 1970s, the first thing that you notice is the 1970s clothes and hair. It's very groovy. But what really stood out to me when I saw these photos for the first time was how adult these teens looked. They had the look of people who are making their own decisions. Now, they're probably the wrong decisions. Smoking, kind of all over each other, I don't know about her shirt. But they have this look of independence to them. So this couple has that. Then there's my favorite, which is this guy. That's a bottle of peppermint schnapps in his waistband. Yeah, not vodka, peppermint schnapps. Probably for the ladies, yep. And boomers and Gen Xers in particular sometimes will be like, I knew that guy. And I know what you guys are doing in the back. You're like, you're sure that's not you? Or is that your brother? Yeah. So this guy's fun. But then it gets more serious, because check this out. Because how old is that younger kid? Like 10 or 11? And that's clearly his older brother. And his older brother's not like, hey, little brother, what are you doing smoking? You're 10. He's like, nah, let's just stand here and smile in our cool 70s pants. So this is a time capsule. This is something that's pretty much unheard of now. Hardly ever happens now. But it was common enough. Back then, they didn't think twice to have a stranger take the picture. So with our data, we can look at the speed of development in this way. These are 4 things that adults do and children don't. So this survey is done when they're finishing their high school education. So most are 18, the rest are 17. And that's the year they're across the bottom. It's the year they graduated from high school. So it's basically the year they're turning 18. And we can see by the time they're about 18 years old, what percentage have their driver's license. And legally they can get their driver's license by 17 in every state. Well, back in the 70s, it used to be about 90% had their driver's license. And now it's a little above 70. So how many, by about 18, have tried alcohol in any significant quantity? That used to be almost all of them. Now it's actually less than 60%. How many ever go out on dates? So that has shown a big change as well. Yeah, it used to be, again, almost everybody, 17 and 18-year-olds. Now it's really low. And when I give this talk to high school students, the whole room just gets really loud when I show them this. They all start talking to each other. And they're saying, I don't know, do you date? What about your friend? I don't know. Am I a loser? I'm not sure. I'm sure what they're saying, but they're fascinated by this. And then ever having a paid job during the school year, again as a 17 or 18-year-old, didn't really change consistently until about 2000. Of course, went down during the recession that we had here in the US 10 years ago. But it's only crept up by a couple of percentage points. It's really only crawled back up. And it's still nowhere near where it used to be in the 1990s or in the 1980s. So another thing that 13 and 16 and 18-year-olds like to do is to go out without their parents. And we can see the times per week that they do that over the years across 3 different age groups. And you'll see these numbers again, so let me tell you what these are. So 12th grade, that's 17 and 18-year-olds. 10th grade, 15 and 16-year-olds. And 8th grade is 13 and 14-year-olds. So here's the trend over time for the 17 and 18-year-olds. And for the 15 and 16-year-olds, 13 and 14-year-olds. It's not just the decline here that they're going out less. It's also that if you look at that blue line for the 17 and 18-year-olds, it's now lower than it was for the 13 and 14-year-olds just a few years ago. So the 18-year-olds look like what the 14-year-olds used to look like not even that long ago. And then, as they become young adults, there's a new word. Actually, it's an old word used in a new way. Did you know that the word adult is now a verb? As in, please don't make me adult today. Or, I'm done adulting today. I still haven't figured out how that works. Go back to being a child. At least one person thinks, yeah, that's exactly how it works. I'll be in my fort coloring if you need me. I'm done adulting for the day. And by fort, they don't mean they're going to go fight. They mean they're going to color and hide out in this thing under the canopy like a 5 or 6 year old. It's now possible to take classes in adulting. Apparently, they teach you how to do laundry. Possibly useful. So what are the applications of this to the working world? First we have to acknowledge a lot of these are great trends. They're great trends for safety and for kids not growing up too fast. However, it also means that we have a generation who's arriving at adulthood who just hasn't had as much experience with independence, and thus can be difficult for them to make decisions on their own. So this is what I hear when I speak at universities across the US, that I hear a lot of people say, I have more and more students who can't make even simple decisions without texting their parents. And I'm not saying that in terms of criticism, I'm saying it in terms of empathy, that if you think back to your own time of becoming an adult, and then imagine what that would have been like if you hadn't really had that much time to be apart from your parents, and you hadn't gone out that much, you didn't have any experience at all with alcohol or any of those things. And then imagine what that transition, how much harder that would have been if you hadn't had those experiences of making your own decisions. So that is a tough adjustment for a lot in this generation, even after college, because they often spend those university years having those text conversations with their parents about every decision. And they get into the workplace, and that's a real challenge. So what I see a lot with the university students that I teach, and I'm hearing this from a lot of managers as well, is the need for structure and clear directions. So I have a syllabus in my university class, and at one time those were short documents, 1 page, 2 pages. Now they're 10 pages because you have to spell out all of the details for the students. It's actually now at my university, they just passed a thing, it's mandatory that you have to have another 2 pages of exactly telling them what to do and what not to do. So that's what they want, and that's what they've gotten used to in their schooling, is being told exactly what to do at every point. You really got to spell things out for them in a way that you might not have had to for previous generations. All right. So our second trend is in terms of social interaction and media. So, as we know, millennials, but especially iGen, spend a lot of time on their phones and a lot of time on technology. So do most of us. But for them, they take that for granted. So we can ask, well, what about more traditional media? Is it true, this is important for marketing too, is it true they don't watch traditional television as much? It is, which is interesting because TV watching among teens was really stable until about the mid-2000s. Going to the movies, well, that's another interesting one because there have been a lot of technological disruptions to going to the movies. How many of you remember going to the video rental store, and getting movies? And they're always sold out of the one you wanted, so you had to argue with your friend about which one to get instead. So I wondered what the trend would look like in going out to the movies. I was kind of surprised that video rentals didn't have that much of an impact. Some ups and downs, but again, it was the mid-2000s when things really started to shift, when going out to the movies became less popular compared to, say, watching it at home or by yourself. And then as an educator, I was particularly interested in this next one, reading a book, a magazine, or a newspaper almost every day. So that is one of the biggest generational shifts in any data I've ever seen. So this doesn't specify format. It could be a book on a Kindle or a magazine article on an iPad, but as you can see, that wasn't enough to save it. That young people, the majority, used to read a book, magazine, or newspaper almost every day, even not assigned for school. 60%, and now it's at 15%. So that number's been divided by 4. It's a really, really radical shift. So it's almost like this: a librarian hands the kid a book and says, just think of it as if you're reading a long text message. So most of what especially young people are doing on their devices is either entertainment or communicating with their friends. Given that, I wondered, well, what's happened to the old-fashioned way, communicating with people face-to-face? So we can see that in these same sets of data, again with the 13 to 18-year-olds, the percentage who get together with their friends face-to-face almost every day across the years. And it's a pretty big change. So there's the trend for the 17 and 18-year-olds, 15 and 16-year-olds, and the 13 and 14-year-olds. And that is a pretty big shift, going from about half doing that every day to more like 1 out of 4. There's a similar trend in going to parties once a month or more across all 3 of the age groups as well. Less likely to go out to parties. And then once they get to university, sometimes even when they do go to a party, it ends up looking like this. Probably all been to a party that looked a little like that. So you have to ask, well, if you go back and look, where did this change start? Well, it starts to slide around 2000, maybe when the internet became more popular. And it really, really accelerates after about 2011 or 2012. That's when you see the real escalation. So you have to ask, what happened around that time? 2011 or 2012? Well, among other things, this happened. So according to the Pew Research Center, the end of 2012 was the first time when the majority of Americans owned a smartphone. And so for the first time, you may have your own memory of this, the first time you're in a public place and everybody was looking at their phones. And you didn't see scenes like this just a few years before this, say 2009 or so, because you know what people had back then? They had flip phones, the old-fashioned phones, you remember those? You know, they just weren't that interesting. You just had to press the same button for like 3 times to get 1 letter on a text, remember that? You take a selfie, is that me or is that my dog? Like, it just didn't look that great. But end of 2012, beginning of 2013, that's when the shift started to happen. So overall, the amount of time that teens say they spend online has doubled since 2006. If you add together the amount of time they say they spend texting, online, and on social media, just 3 activities and just during leisure time, not counting work or homework, it adds up to about 6 hours a day. And more comprehensive surveys suggest the number's even probably higher, closer to 8 or even 9 hours a day. No matter what number you choose, that's a lot of time. So that might be one of the reasons why they're spending less time with each other face to face. So what we have is a generation coming into the workplace that has just a lot less experience reading long-form text, meaning books, magazine articles, things like that, as opposed to, say, you know, captions on an Instagram post. So where a lot of universities are taking this, and I think a lot of workplaces will follow, is electronic books, more interactive learning, more videos for things like onboarding and orientation. I think we're going to start to see that more and more instead of reading something that's longer. Even more challenging is this, that we have a generation that just has less experience with face-to-face social interaction who's coming into the workplace. And this is what a lot of people are concerned about. This is what I hear from managers everywhere I go. They'll tell me what they like about iGen, but then they'll say, I'm surprised at how many of them will not look me in the eye. And they don't have the social skills we need them to have for the jobs that we're going to be hiring for. So that's what I hear from managers. What I hear from a lot of iGeners themselves, you say university students, is they'll talk about how they have anxiety around interacting with other people. They'll talk about how they would rather text than have a face-to-face conversation. Because when they text, they can think about what they're going to say next. So I think in the workplace, we're going to start to see more emphasis on training for face-to-face social interactions. They may come in with some of the technology skills for communication in that way, but they just don't have as much experience with communicating with others face-to-face as previous generations did. So our next trend, optimism, mental health, and risk-taking. These may not seem related, but I'll show you how they are. So first, this is millennials. If you look at the primary cultural influence on the millennial generation, it is individualism. So that means more focus on the self, less focus on social rules. That has a lot of positive things, like tolerance and optimism, positive self-views. It has some downsides like narcissism and entitlement. But it has these clear upsides, a lot of optimism. So that's the view that we have for millennials. More happiness, positive self-views, and then something happened. I don't know why that's in there, we've seen that already. So here's an example. This is an example around positive self-views. So the 17 and 18-year-olds are asked, how satisfied are you with yourself? So that's like a measure of self-esteem. So in the transition from the boomers to the Gen Xers to the millennials, that was going up. Then something happened. It just really went down right around 2012, and that's when you see the transition between the millennial generation and the iGen generation. So they're also asked, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole? And that shows a very similar pattern. You also see it in more serious issues like depression. So this only goes back to 2006, but we can see depression among teenagers was pretty stable till about 2000, and then it just shoots upward. 75% more teens in 2018 compared to 2011 have clinical level depression. So that's depression that really needs treatment. And then among young adults, so this is those who are at university or maybe going to enter the workplace, 18 to 25-year-olds, it took another year or so to increase, and now that increase is even steeper. It's now caught up to the level of the teens. So the transition that we have is from, a lot of times millennials experience technology as connecting. iGeners talk about technology differently. They talk about how it feels mandatory, it feels disconnecting, that it can feel isolating, how they feel left out. So there's that fear of missing out that they have when they can't look at their phone, but then even when they do look at their phones, they still often feel left out. Because, for example, on the weekend, they might be at home and then they can see the pictures that their friends are posting from the cool party that they went to. So they feel left out when they're on social media, and they feel left out when they're not on social media. It's like they feel like they can't win. That's what one university student told me recently. For millennials, a lot of them had parents who were very encouraging and positive. And then there was this shift where a lot of iGeners parents were not just protective, but even fearful. And we can see this in expectations around the workplace as well, because the 17 and 18-year-olds are asked about their expectations. So, for example, they're asked, what job do you expect to be working in when you're 30 years old? So the top category is a professional job. So that'd be like a doctor or a lawyer or a manager. And here's what the trend looks like over the years, that more and more teens, from the boomer era to Gen Xers to millennials, said, yeah, I think I'm going to reach that top level. And then again, it falls with iGen. Now what you'd expect for this next one, they're asked, well, how likely do you think that is to happen, that you're going to get that job that you want? Well, as their expectations grow, these numbers should go down. They actually don't. So not only do they think they're going to have that job, they're just as confident that they'll get it, even more so. But then again, even though iGen's expectations became more realistic, they also started to doubt those expectations. So you're really seeing this breakdown in optimism and expectations in this transition from millennials to iGen. And these are really striking generational shifts. The generational shifts, as you see, usually build on themselves. They kind of go in the same direction. So for them to turn around, and to turn around so quickly, is very striking. Kind of like the mismatch of expectations that you see here. There's the expectation, there's the actual reality. That's sort of the transition between millennials and iGen. The other big shift in the culture around child rearing is the big focus on safety. So playgrounds, more plastic, more adult supervision. Kids to pay, if they don't weigh that much, they often have to ride in a car seat until they're 12 years old. There's a lot of benefits to this. We've done a good job here in the US keeping alcohol and cigarettes away from kids and teens for a longer time. But it's also extended into other things too. At schools, any place they work with kids, safety is always the number one thing that they come back to. Sometimes for things that make sense, sometimes for things that are a little ridiculous. Like, why you're going to give your very young child a smartphone. What's really interesting to me, if you think about these age groups, 15 years old, 18 years old, historically, these have been generations who took a lot, that's been in ages of people. They take a lot of risks at that age, just developmentally. They're like, yeah, nothing can hurt me, safety, whatever. But iGen hasn't rejected that. They have really embraced it. They see not taking safety precautions as old school, like this. It's young people have put these types of memes online, and what they're saying with this is, it's those reckless old people. It's a total flip from what you would expect. You can see that in these big surveys too. So those who say, kind of you'd think, a typical teenager thing to say, I get a kick out of doing dangerous things. Well, there's been a drop in the number who agree with that since about 2012. Same thing with, I'd like to take risks sometimes. But it's not just physical risks. It's also economic or financial or life risks that they have some doubts about. So it's been rumored that iGen is uniquely entrepreneurial, that they're interested in owning their own business, being self-employed. But when you look at this data collected across time, when everybody's the same age, but across generations, you actually don't really see that. What you see is the opposite. It was actually the baby boomers and Gen Xers who were more interested in owning their own business or being self-employed. And there's been a little bit of an uptick, probably because it's easier to have your own business online, but the comparison with iGen and millennials to previous generations still holds, that contrary to popular belief, they're actually a little less likely to be interested in striking out on their own, probably because it's risky. So you can see this in their behaviors as well. They're less likely to binge drink, so binge drinking, having a lot of alcohol at one time. And there's a contrast between what they think is safe, so they know it's not as safe anymore, the public health campaigns have done their job. But what's interesting is, what teenagers usually do, they live on the edge, right? More of them do it than think it's safe, because they're like, I know it's not safe, but I'm gonna go, and have tons of drinks with my friends anyway. That's what being young used to be about. Then the lines cross, right, around that transition between millennials and iGen. So now fewer iGeners drink a lot of alcohol at one time compared to the number who think it's safe. So they're playing it safe as well as having those attitudes around safety. So we have a big transition from the millennials, a generation that's very confident, optimistic, high expectations, willing to take risks, sometimes even entitled, to a generation that is not those things, where we have that fall off in expectations, in optimism. On top of that, more depression and anxiety. And I think we'll see this. We're already seeing this in the workplace, and it's going to continue. Increased need for mental health services. There's an insecurity, at the root of iGen as well, that they are concerned about making it in a job. They are not as interested in being entrepreneurs as people had thought. And you can read online lots of articles where they'll say that that's what iGen is all about. Well, they might be interested in that because they're young, because when you compare 18-year-olds now compared to what 18-year-olds used to say, they're actually a little less interested in it. What they seem to want instead is a more defined career path, something that is safer. And I think across a lot of different realms, they're going to want more reassurance about safety, both physical safety and also what they call emotional safety. So this is a fairly new phrase. They want to be safe from being upset. And we can talk about exactly what that means in the Q&A if you like. It's a somewhat complex concept. So what does this mean for, say, giving feedback to these generations? Everybody loves praise, but they want it for different reasons. Millennials need praise because they feel like they're doing a good job. iGen needs it for reassurance because they have more of that insecurity and less optimism. And the way to deliver it, kind of the classic advice is this, that it's called the praise sandwich, that you give positive praise, constructive criticism, and then positive praise. Occasionally managers will say, what if I don't have anything positive to say? But I'm sure you can think of something in there. But it's good to frame it in that way. I think the other really useful way to frame feedback is this, that I'm on your side. I want you to be successful, so that's why I'm telling you this. Because sometimes those interactions can go wrong, especially with this generation gap, when they're hearing this as just criticism. But if it's framed as, I want you to be successful, that can be really helpful. Here's the other thing. That idea of you evaluate people on an annual basis just doesn't work anymore. So there's the expectation for feedback being more frequent. And of course it can't be every second, because that would be too much work, but it definitely has to be more than that annual review, because that is really expected. People are more impatient, technology has given people faster feedback, that's the expectation. A lot of workplaces have moved to 360 reviews, so it's not just the boss evaluating the employees, the employee evaluating the boss. That comes with individualism. That's something that has been more popular in the last 10 years or so. And as part of this overall style of, instead of there being the boss and then the employees, it's more flat. It's a more democratic leadership style. There was a transition a few decades ago, at least here in the US, where people call their bosses by their first names, by their given names, instead of Mr. So-and-so. That's how it works now, generally, in most workplaces. So that shows how things have become flatter and more democratic. So we can also talk about specifically what are the shifts in motivation and what are the shifts in attitudes toward work. So we're going to mostly try to focus on these three questions. Where does iGen want to work? What job attributes are most important to them? And then what are their motivations? So there's a lot of lines on this slide. I'm going to show them all to you, and then I'll tell you why I showed you so many lines. So these are different industries in which people might want to work. And the higher numbers mean they're more likely to say, yeah, that's a good place to work. I think that's a desirable industry to work in. So as you saw, there's been a little bit of a decline in those who want to own their own business. Small business, pretty much the same. Large corporation, that kind of hit its peak in the late 80s. So here's all the others. Okay, now why did I show you all of those lines? Because, you see what they're doing? They're coming together. It's almost as if iGen in particular is saying, I'm not even sure I care where I work. I just want to have a good, stable job. They just seem to not be as picky because it's coming together. They don't have as strong of a preference about where they're going to work. So what about specific attitudes around work? So we'll look first at boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials, and we'll throw iGen into the mix in a minute. And the way this is set up, boomers are at 0 and then it goes out, and that's just so we can focus on what the differences are, because these are all on different scales. So one of the questions, and again this is the 17 and 18-year-olds, but at different time periods, so these are the time periods which they were answered those questions. Do you agree that work is just making a living? So it's just something to make money. So that attitude became more prevalent as we transitioned from boomers to Gen Xers to millennials. Do you want a job with a lot of vacation time? looks the same. And then, are you willing to work overtime or long hours? I saw some of you shaking your head, so yep, you know what I mean. That's been the transition there. Now these next three really surprised me. Do you want a job that's interesting? Actually went down. A lot of people say, oh, millennials, they want a job that's interesting, that's very fulfilling. It's like that actually became less important when you take age out of the equation and you're just focusing on generational differences. Do you want a job where you can make friends? Also has gone down. A job where you can help others, down by a little bit, fairly constant. So these things about, kind of the more intrinsic values of making friends and a job that's interesting, that actually has become less important over time. So now let's look at what happened when we throw iGen in, or Gen Z. So they've continued that trend in saying, yeah, work's just making a living. A little bit of a dial back on vacation time. So that's actually bounced back a little bit. Yeah.
In previous slides, iGen borders were up to 2020. Now they're a bit.
So, sorry, this is when they're 18 years old. So this isn't the birth years, this is the year when they're 18 years old. Yeah, thank you for asking. So that's when they filled out the survey. Okay, and then a job that's interesting, where you can make friends, those have still gone down. So we still don't have a generation that's very uniquely interested in that. And then a job where you can help others has bounced back. It's now slightly higher than it was for boomers. So there's, again, you see where iGen in some cases is breaking with the previous trends. In other cases, they are continuing the trends that were begun by Gen X and continued by millennials. So we can dial in more precisely on the questions around work ethic or work-life balance. So here's what it looks like across all of the years with the willingness to work overtime. You can see that started to turn around about 10 years ago. And then you expect work to be a central part of your life. So that's come back by a little bit too. But the overall picture we have, at 18, time of entering university or entering the workplace, that it's boomers who are the most likely to say, yeah, I want to work overtime, it's going to be a central part of my life, that's really core for me, and then it's backed off. But we do see that transition, late millennials to iGen, where it starts to come back. All right, what about motivation? We have a lot of different cultural influences that they play a role here. We have the Great Recession 10 years ago, we have income inequality, we have social media, which may lead to more insecurity and upward comparison. A lot more focus on the end goal. So online they call it #goals. That in general, we just see a lot more focus on practicality. So in psychology, we use these terms. We contrast intrinsic values, so things like having a job that's interesting would fall into that, or just the inherent joy in doing it, helping other people, relationships with others, that's intrinsic values. Extrinsic values are things like money and fame and image. So just having the job, having the salary, that type of thing. One way to illustrate extrinsic values is to show you the poster that my brother had on his wall in the 1980s, which was this one. And I always look at this and I say, hey, I have a lot of higher education. I don't have any of this. But then my brother is an investment banker in New York, and he doesn't have that either, so that helps me feel like a tiny bit better. So here is the pattern in extrinsic and intrinsic values. So this is a sample of university students, and there's a tendency of later generations to say everything is important, so I've corrected that on the scale here. But they're asked, why did you decide to go to college or go to university in the first place? Well, over time, more have said, I'm going to college to make more money, as opposed to, I'm going to college to get an education and an appreciation of ideas. They're also asked, what are some life goals? What's the importance of being very well off financially? So that's become much more important. The importance of developing a meaningful philosophy of life, that's become much less important. So the general pattern is an increase in the emphasis on the extrinsic values, money, fame, and image, and so on, and a decline in the intrinsic values. So the inherent joy in the activity of education, philosophy, all of those types of things. So work-life balance is the biggest shift that we see in those specific work attitudes that by far showed the biggest differences. So I think that's where you see, a lot of, if you're going to say, what can we actually say there's really truly a generational difference when we take age out of the equation, that work-life balance is where it is. We also see that practicality, that focus on getting a good job. It's not quite as important if it's interesting or you can make friends there. They don't care as much about what industry they're working in or how fulfilling it is per se. The one possible exception to that intrinsic-extrinsic motivation shift is in helping others, whereas you saw that did come back with iGen. And the way that both millennials and iGen often talk about that is not necessarily in terms of the specifics of helping others, but making a difference. That's the phrase that they often use to describe that. So I'm going to talk about some of the applications in this area, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion to get into specifics on this too. So I'm just going to mention a few things in each of these areas to kind of get your thinking going. So in terms of recruiting and retaining those in these generations, I mentioned the making a difference. That's something to emphasize. That's language they have grown up hearing. They want recognition for individual work and success, not just being part of a team or being part of an organization. They want to know, how am I having an impact? Because there's more turnover and people who are not having the same job for their whole life, you need to answer this question too for recruits and young hires of, how is this going to help me get a better job next time? And how is it going to help me build my career? So they want that security in an age of income inequality. They also are very interested in mentoring and guidance. Many of them have a very close relationship with their parents, so that's something that they're open to, as opposed to a lot of previous generations like, nope, I can do it myself. That's not something you'll find as much these days. And think about the language that they grew up hearing. So we did an analysis recently using the Google Books database and found there's been a big increase in individualistic words like unique and personalize and identity and second person, so you and yourself and yours became much more common in books. So these are all things, all words that are more about the self. And that's, again, things that they grew up hearing. And then as you saw, emphasizing that, oh, you're going to make friends here, that's just not as important to them as it was to young people a few generations ago. So that's probably not something to emphasize as much. So sometimes millennials are called Gen Y, the letter. Other people say, no, they should be Y, like, why? Why do I need to do it? And that's not a complaint. It's more that they need to know why they're doing it. Why they matter, why what they're doing matters. Again, the idea of I'm just going to be part of a team is not as much of a winner. And they want to make that personal impact, which is a good thing. Because you think about the enormous amount of change in just the last 10 years in terms of technology. These are the generations that have that knowledge, that grew up with this technology. And yeah, they might be able to think of a better way of doing things. And we have to sometimes hold back on, no, there's a reason we've always done it that way. Well, sometimes that's true. But sometimes those new ideas are really good. I mentioned this before, that structure, clear directions. I have this in here twice for a reason, because it's something that comes up so often in workplaces these days, especially those who are hiring 21, 22, 23-year-olds. So I mentioned emotional safety. This has become a controversial topic here in the US. on college campuses of the idea of having a safe space. So that used to have a different meaning. Now, what that sometimes means on some campuses is if there's a speaker comes in who a lot of people disagree with, instead of, say, going to the speech and asking questions, or just not going to the speech at all and ignoring it, now sometimes they have a room where people can go, where they have soft pillows and nice music and videos of puppies. Not kidding. If they disagree, and they can make themselves feel better. So this is some of the stuff around emotional safety. It would not surprise me if in workplaces fairly soon we start getting requests for safe spaces at work. And this is a generation that's just grown up with taking for granted equality around race and gender and sexual orientation. And when they don't see that, that's something that often surprises them, even shocks them. And there's just not that much tolerance for it. So what about this? Some people have had this experience on both sides. A lot of us are Gen Xers, we may have experienced this in both directions, either talking to the younger person and saying, hey, come by my office, or having our older manager say this, and then, well, there's easier, faster ways to do this. Send me an email, send me a text. So there's these differences in communication style. Do you want to communicate face-to-face? Do you want to call on the phone? So iGeners never answer their phones. They never actually talk on the phone. They do everything else on the phone, but they hardly ever answer it, and they never pick up voicemail. So if you leave a voicemail for a 23-year-old, they're not going to get it. There's just this big transition. And in the workplace, I think we have to strike a balance because on the one hand, these technologies are very, very convenient. For things like this, setting up a meeting, stuff like that, yeah, it makes some sense to do it that way. But for building relationships with clients, for team building among employees, for all of these things, face-to-face is going to work better. Nothing will ever truly replace that human relationship of being in the same room. So I will end this portion anyway with this thought. How much is the world going to change for this generation? And then how much does the generation change to adapt to the world? Well, we've already seen some of both in the workplace. We're already seeing more emphasis on praise, more flexibility, more democratic leadership styles, all of those things. And a lot of that is good, but it does have to be balanced. Because we can do those things, but if it doesn't improve our financial results or the work performance, then it's not a winner. So sometimes we have to give this generation what they need as well as what they want. I find that in my classroom on a regular basis, that sure, we can do videos, sure, we can have more discussions and more interactive things, but you still have to learn the material, and guess what? You still have to read the book. So we have to find that balance. And I think the organizations that can find that balance will be the most successful now and in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.